I can still remember the sound of the security gate clanging shut the first time I walked into a youth prison. I had just been asked to step in as director of juvenile corrections, and I thought I should tour the state's facility. I have never forgotten what I saw that day. In fact, what I saw and heard that day in many ways leads me to talk to you about what some might consider a radical idea. I believe it is time to close every youth prison in America permanently, every single one of them, and replace them with things that work. Now, I want to tell you how I came to this belief, but I want to explain that I want to call these institutions exactly what they are. These are prisons for kids. They're often called youth development centers or youth rehabilitative centers or training schools or reformatories. But let's call them what they are. These are prisons for kids. Let me tell you a little bit about what I saw that day as I walked through the facility. I saw bright lights everywhere that I went. I saw 100 young people in a facility that had been built for 40. I saw young people wearing sweats with holes in them. I saw young people in handcuffs and shackles. I saw rows of isolation cells, and in each of those cells, I saw a young face staring out because that young person had been held in solitary confinement, sometimes for weeks. The walls of this place virtually dripped with a pervasive sense of dread and anxiety and tension and anger. And everywhere I walked in this facility, there was a sense of imminent violence. Well, I had a terrible night that night. I found myself thinking again and again, what would happen if one of my own children were being held in that place? And I thought, we've got to fix this place. We've got to make it better. And so I worked awfully hard for years. We changed leadership. We brought in new staff training. We brought in new programs. And I went all over the state talking to people about how we had to reform this institution. And I got a very interesting kind of pushback. People began to say to me, you know, Patrick, these are dangerous kids. These are predators. Nothing works with these kids. If we don't lock them up, they're going to destroy our communities. And I realized that we think about these young people and we talk about these young people in very different ways than we think and talk about our own children. We no longer see them as young people who need help to get back on track. Now, I should point out that most of the young people in this institution were black and brown. And for centuries, we have told ourselves very scary stories, and we've created ugly and threatening images about black and brown young people. These images, these stories we tell ourselves, were defeating my ability to change this place. In fact, this place was a monument to the power of those ideas. Everything about this institution said it was about punishment and intimidation rather than an opportunity to turn a life around. The building itself was large, ugly, loud. The cells throughout, lock cells where we would put young people at night, sometimes double and triple bunked like cages. The staff and the kids caught in their role of guard and prisoner, locked in this ongoing struggle of power and resistance. Everything about the place was about aggression, about violence, about control, about submission, and about deviance. We ignore what we know about delinquency because of the power of these ideas and images we've created. We ignore what we know about adolescents, about how their brains are still developing, about how they're still developing judgment, impulse control, decision-making, and emotional maturity. In fact, everything that we know about delinquency itself and the experience of growing up in neighborhoods where poverty is concentrated, where there are no jobs, where there is little hope, everything we know about trauma and chronic stress and mental health, we ignore when we think about this particular group of young people. And we have to ask ourselves, if one of our own children got into serious trouble, what would we want? Would we want to see him cut off from his family? and thrown in with a group of young people who were in serious trouble themselves, and so they became the only family that our child could count on? Would we want to see him pulled out of his school and put in an educational program that at best provides 1 or 2 kids a year with a GED? Would we want to see our child in a place that tells him that he has no future, that in fact everything about his identity is shaped so he starts to see himself as a hardened criminal? Do we want to see him in a place that tells him in 100 different ways that he is simultaneously dangerous and feared and worthless, that he has no future when he leaves, that in fact we drain from him all of his optimism and his hope and fill him up with anger and hate? Because this is what these institutions do. And then we send these kids back to their communities with little follow-up and no connection to opportunity. Because of what we've been doing for the last 150 years, we're getting predictable results. The U.S. leads the world in locking up our kids. And it's not even close. The next closest country, we lock up more than 2.5 or 3 times as many as the next closest country. In more than half of the states, there is documented evidence from just the last few years of systematic and ongoing physical abuse, sexual abuse, inappropriate use of solitary confinement for weeks and weeks and weeks. And you can say, well, at least we're protecting the community. The recidivism rate for these institutions are 60, 70, 80%. We have created factories of failure. We have literally built factories of failure, and we fill those factories of failure with thousands of our young people every year. I believe it's long past time to admit that what we're doing doesn't work, and it's costing billions of dollars and wasting tens of thousands of lives year after year after year. I believe it's time to admit that if one of our own children got into serious trouble, we would do everything we could to make sure that our child spent not even a single day in one of these institutions. And if we admit that, if that's the truth, then we have no moral, ethical, or human choice but to say we cannot wait another 150 years or 50 years or even 10 years. We need to close these facilities, and we need to close them now. Now, some may say the public and politicians would never stand for this, but in fact, we are hearing from all over the country that legislators are starting to ask tough questions about the money we're spending and the lousy results that we're getting. Judges are starting to say that they want to see better options for our children. The media is starting to report on the scandals and the waste and the abuses that we're seeing. Community leaders are saying, let us work with these young people. We can do a better job in our own neighborhoods. Families are organizing to tell their stories. Young people themselves are speaking out about their pain and asking for fundamental reform. So it's fair to ask, can we actually close every youth prison in America? What would it take? We need to take 3 steps. Number 1, we need to reduce the numbers of young people coming into the system itself. In fact, many of us do dumb, impulsive, angry, and sometimes hateful things when we're adolescents, and most of us grow out of it. We need to cut this down by half. Second, we need to reform our juvenile justice system by dramatically expanding our community-based and family-centered programs that have evidence that they work. We have that evidence. We know we can go from these best practices to common practice. We can do this. Third, I know that there are some young people who are at high risk of committing violent crimes. And we know that these young people will have to be in some kind of secure setting while they receive the kind of intensive treatment and rehabilitation that they need to make it less likely that they will commit crime. But we don't need to lock them up in these large facilities. And we're starting to see in a few states where these facilities are starting to be closed and replaced with smaller secure care facilities that actually make a difference in kids' lives. We can do this. I have a message today for every governor and legislator in every state in the union. If you're willing to take these 3 steps to reduce the numbers of kids who come into the system, reform that system with more community-based programs, and replace these youth prisons with secure care programs that actually work, the Annie E. Casey Foundation is willing to help and support you in that effort. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has worked for the last 25 years in juvenile justice in more than 250 places around the country and facilities throughout the nation. We've assembled a terrific team of program experts and researchers and data analysts and advocates who are willing to come and work together with us and together with you to close these facilities down. So again, I ask you, if you are willing to close these facilities down, contact us. We will be ready to help. And I ask everyone listening today, please go to your state leaders and say, we want to close these facilities down. I can still remember the last time I walked out of that youth prison that I tried so hard to change. I can still remember the sound of the young voices of the men fading as I walked through the facility with security door after security door closing behind me. I can actually still remember the sound of that gate closing as I walked out of that facility. I remember the tremendous sense of relief I felt that this place was no longer my problem, no longer my responsibility. And I can still remember the awful guilt that I felt because I had left behind 100 young men in that terrible place. But I've never forgotten them. We can never forget about them. So I ask you to imagine with me the day when we close the last youth prison in America. I ask you to imagine with me the day when we hear the security gate of the last youth prison in America clanging shut. I ask you to imagine that that is the day when we take a huge step forward to fully embrace all of our children, all of their potential, all of their value, and that we say we are no longer going to lead the world. We're going to leave the shame of leading the world and locking our kids up behind, but instead we're going to invest in our children, every single one of them, even and perhaps especially those who are most troubled. We can do this. Thank you.